Liberal MP Anthony Housefather says he'll stay in the Liberal caucus. Just 2 weeks ago, he said he needed time to reflect after the government voted in favor of a motion on Palestinian statehood, a vote that Housefather called a huge slap in the face to Canada's Jewish community. Liberal MP Anthony Housefather joins me now. Mr. Housefather, it's good to speak with you again. Thanks for taking the time.
Good to speak with you too, David.
I wonder if you could tell me exactly when you made this decision. You've been reflecting for several weeks. When did you decide you were a Liberal to stay?
I have been reflecting and thinking about it very hard, and I really only made the decision in the last day or so. I had some extensive conversations with the Prime Minister over the last 3 days, and one of the things that we talked about, in fact, the thing that we talked the most about, was the fear and intimidation felt by Jewish Canadians, whether related to the demonstrations outside of Jewish community buildings and businesses, or alternatively, what's happening on college campuses. And I really had very, very painful discussions where we talked about what I felt was not enough action by the government. And he said, come work with me, come work with Deborah Lyons, play a leadership role on this file, and we will fix it. And I believe that if I'm involved, I will make a difference. I will work very, very hard with Deborah and the Prime Minister and others to make a meaningful difference for Jewish Canadians, because I think anti-Semitism in Canada is a problem for everyone. It's a national security issue. It's an issue, a threat to our democracy. And more important, it could happen to any group here. So that was really what put me over the tipping point. It was the commitment to a meaningful leadership role in anti-Semitism where the government will really act.
Right.
And of course, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, so Deborah Lyons is the special envoy on combating anti-Semitism, and I just wonder if you could give us some more specifics on that. Like, what extra actions are we going to see from your government on this? Because the Jewish community, as you well know, has been frustrated with the federal government's response to this. They've been criticized by the Conservatives. So what fundamentally do you expect to see change in a way that makes you comfortable with your decision?
Again, I will be involved in developing an action plan with Deborah, and I will come back to you and tell you exactly what that is, but I can give you some specifics. I think when it comes to IRA, we need to get a handbook out to explain how to implement IRA, and we need to get universities across the country to deal with the anti-Semitism on university campuses. We need to make sure that codes of conduct are up to snuff. I want to encourage them to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, there's all kinds of things related to locations of demonstrations on campus that can make students feel safer. I am going to, and I can tell you, look at the issues right there. My city, in my municipalities of Hampstead and Cook St. Luke, are adopting resolutions like Vaughan, I believe in Ontario, has, that say you need to have a protected space between buildings and demonstrators. All of these things, education of police, all of these things are things that we can work on, roll out, and make things better for people, even if it's not within our jurisdiction. Deborah and I and others can use our bully pulpit to bring people together and to give them offers of solutions. So to me, there's a lot of work that can be done, and I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get that done, because that can't wait 18 months. That has to happen now.
Okay, IRA, for people at home, is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, if I'm remembering that acronym correctly, so people know. So it's that definition you want to be adopted and implemented and followed and recognized in a way to reduce the insecurity and the threats and the fear that Jewish Canadians are feeling across the country and feeling on university campuses in particular. So you say you've spoken with the Prime Minister. I have to ask, Mr. Housefather, because it's felt like the Conservatives were making overtures to you, and there was a lot of suggestions that you had been speaking with them. Did you speak with other parties about possibly joining them, the Conservatives in particular, as you were reflecting?
Look, I'm not going to reveal private discussions. As I said, I was considering all options. And again, I have lots of friends in the Conservative caucus. But, in the end, I made a decision. It wasn't like this was an easy decision, because that vote was deeply painful to me and many members of my community. As I explained in the statement that I issued today, I didn't come to this decision easily. But I also, David, heard from Canadians across the country, many of whom were Liberals who were slightly disaffected, who were centrist voices in the party. And they said, if you leave, what is going to happen to centrist voices in the party? What is going to happen to voices that stand by the United States and stand by Western democracies and stand by countries like Israel against threats and autocratic nations like Iran and their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah? Who's going to stand for fiscal responsibility? Who's going to stand for a strong charter of rights and a strong national government that stands up to provinces when they invoke the notwithstanding clause preemptively? And I reflected on that, and I believe that my voice as a centrist is also important in the Liberal Party, and I don't want to abandon that space.
Okay, in your statement, you outline many of the issues that are core to the Liberals' identity and that the values that you share with them. But there is still this disagreement on the foreign policy approach to the conflict in the Middle East and this government's approach to dealing with Israel. That's not going away. So this position, this decision you've taken, like, is this tenable for the long term? Because we saw President Biden, for example, take a tougher line with Israel this week. I don't suspect Melanie Joly is going to get any softer in her critique of the way the Israeli government is conducting this conflict. I mean, how comfortable are you with living with this position should they take other positions on a foreign policy level that you don't agree with when it comes to Israel?
Well, again, I think if I leave, where are the pro-Israel voices in the Liberal Party? I need to be there to lead along with Marco Mendicino and Ben Carr and others to make clear that the Liberal Party, which is a strong national governing party and has people from representing all Canadians, well, the Canadians that agree with me need to be represented too. And, I don't think that is blind agreement with the Israeli government that anyone is calling for. Mm-hmm. I can disagreements with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I can have disagreements with ways that Israel may be conducting the war. That's a very different thing than the motion that the NDP originally proposed before the House. And so I will fight for my vision. I will use my bully pulpit, and I will be in caucus and fight for the positions that I hold dear. And it's not only about foreign policy in Israel. It's about other things too. I believe in for example, meeting NATO commitments and a strong armed forces. I mean, there's a lot more to this whole issue, including foreign policy, than just Israel.
No, understood. But when you outline these things, they're not necessarily positions I would associate with the core values of the cabinet. I'm not saying they don't support Western democracies, but like hitting the NATO target, for instance, the fiscal responsibilities bent that you talk about, this is a government that likes to spend. I just wonder, when you outline the reasons why you feel you need to stay, because if you leave, there's no voice on those issues in the caucus, should we take that to mean you don't think those are necessarily there in sufficient mass? They're not there in the cabinet? How should we interpret that?
I think you should interpret it by the fact that I have deep core beliefs as to what the Liberal Party should be, and that I believe that my place is now there fighting for those values. I thought about it long and hard. I thought about, does my voice still matter in the party, or should I abandon the space and just leave? And I was really touched by the detailed emails I received from literally thousands of people outside of my riding that talked about their viewpoint as Liberals and asked me to stay and fight for the kind of values that we shared. And so I am going to do that, and I'm not going to be shy about it. And if I don't agree with things, I will say so. But for me, the Liberal Party has to be a centrist party. It cannot be the NDP light. It has to be a centrist party that speaks to Canadians on the left of center, and even to some extent on the right of center. And I'm an unapologetically proud Canadian. And I don't want to be ashamed of that. I want to fight for those values in the Liberal Party.
I have to just come back, though, to the issue of Israel. And I know that is, you are about more than that issue, but that is a very important issue right now. And it is one that has forced you into this very public period of difficult reflection. And to circle back to where I was earlier, this is not an issue that appears like it's going to go away anytime soon. So how confident are you that, having made this decision today, that you're going to be able to live with whatever choices your government makes when it comes to the Israeli government and this particular conflict in the coming weeks and months?
Look, I can only say that I will be there fighting for the values that I hold dear. I can't pretend to say that everything that the government will do will be something that I'll agree with, but at least I'll have my voice at the table at a time when the Liberal Party is in power. And that's a really important thing, because if my voice is not there, that's taking away a pro-Israel voice from the party that's in power. And so I would say, though, David, that again, this is, I think, a much broader issue than Israel. Mm-hmm. I think it's an entire vision of how foreign policy is conducted. And I think that the motion that was adopted, to me, unfortunately, rewards Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah over Israel. And I don't think that was in anybody's best interest. I think the government amendments made it far better, but the initial motion was absolutely terrible.
So just as a final point, you say you made this decision in the last number of hours, last couple of days, after intensive conversations with the Prime Minister. Is it those conversations with Justin Trudeau that convinced you to stay, and how close were you to leaving?
Like I said, I was going back and forth in my head as to whether or not my voice still mattered in the party. And yes, the direct conversations with the Prime Minister, with the Deputy Prime Minister, made a significant difference. When Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland take the time to speak to you at length, it certainly made a difference. And I really feel that there is a real commitment to fighting anti-Semitism one of the most important goals of the government. And that, to me, because my Jewish community, although I represent everyone, not just Jews, my Jewish community and Jews across Canada are very scared and very intimidated. That was a meaningful thing to me, and I want to be part of that work.
And were you thinking, just as the last question, were you weighing between sitting as an independent or joining another party?
I was weighing all options, like I said from the beginning. I thought about everything, but I don't believe an independent has much value in our system. I wish it did. I wish independents had more power in the Canadian political system. But right now, unfortunately, you can't speak in the House without permission. You can't be on committees. It's not really a tenable thing that gives the best to your constituents.
Okay, so it was either Liberals or Conservatives, it sounds like.
Well, again, I considered all options, but one rejected because it wasn't a good option for my constituents.
Okay. Liberal MP Anthony Housefather, thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you very much, David.
All right, we're going to talk about all of that with the Friday Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. The CBC's Jason Markusoff is in Calgary today. And here with me in studio, editorial writer for Le Devoir, Marie Bastel, and the Toronto Star Ottawa Bureau Chief, Tanda McCharles. Okay, Marie, what do you make of this move? How is this going to play in Quebec? Are you surprised he's staying, given Mount Royal has been Liberal since the 1940s? What do you make of this move?
I believe I was here 2 weeks ago and said I would be very, 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 very surprised if he went to the Conservatives. For gestures posed by the Conservatives in the past in that writing, which I think if you're a longtime Liberal like Anthony Housefather, I don't know if you get over them trying to push out your predecessor, Irwin Cutler, who was not, an not respected MP and legal expert. And then there's also all sorts of other reasons why Anthony Housefather doesn't necessarily agree with the Conservative Party. He's very aligned with them on this conflict and on the unwavering support to Israel, but there's a lot of other issues where I don't think he would. And for the reasons you said, the writing having been Liberal since the 40s, even in 2011 when the Liberals had this disastrous election, Mr. Housefather still did, not Mr. Housefather, but the Liberals still did pretty well. And I truly don't believe Mr. Housefather probably didn't care that much about just getting his seat. I think this is really like a core values issue for him. I would expect that there is a big sigh of relief in the government, PMO, and Liberal circles. Mr. Housefather is respected, even though he's very often dissenting. He's very respected by his fellow Liberal MPs. And, there's always the risk that if one leaves, others kind of follow suit or start thinking about it. So, but I do think, to your point in your interview with him, I think it's going to be difficult because Mr. Housefather is right. The Liberal government's position has slid throughout this conflict. Yeah. Less of an unwavering support of Israel and more of a sensitivity to the unproportionality of what is going on in Gaza. And he's also correct when he says we didn't have a big policy debate and policy paper on the government's position in Israel. It wasn't thoroughly discussed, maybe in caucus, but I doubt it. And so I'm not. He's right when he says there's been all these changes, and I guess he's saying no one talked to us about it. Hopefully he does get to have his voice heard within the government, because there's a lot of people who also agree with this sliding of position of the government.
Right, and Tanda, he said he got conversations with the Prime Minister multiple times, it sounds like, with the Deputy Prime Minister, and he said those were central to him staying. But this issue of Israel, which is the one big bit of disagreement between him and the caucus on this, that is not going to go away. We've seen the UK shift positions this week, the US shift positions.
No, if anything, you know,
it's going to get harder.
It's still set to be a longer conflict than perhaps anyone thought last fall, and it's still set to be a very tough one. Look what happened this week with the killing of the humanitarian aid workers. That has brought on some much more difficult conversations at the leader level as well. So, no, it's not going to be an easy road for Mr. Housefather, given where he stands on it. But look, I think that the Liberal caucus may be heaving somewhat a sigh of relief to keep him in there. But on the other hand, when this whole motion that triggered his angst was voted on, that whole day we were hearing that 50 up to 70, perhaps 80 MPs might have voted on the other side of it. So offside with Mr. Housefather. So he's still got, I guess, a big job to persuade his own caucus to hold fast to their support of Israel. I think that's just like the government, the cabinet's position has shifted. The caucus position is very tenuous, right? So I don't think it's easy. But the fact that they're offering for him to do domestic anti-Semitism work with the envoy Deborah Lyons, I don't know that gives him, the kind of impact that he hopes to have on this issue, because that envoy office really hasn't done much to stem the rise of anti-Semitism.
But it might be the only impact he can have in a caucus where the Liberals represent 23 out of the 25 ridings with the biggest Jewish population, same proportions for Muslim population. They're so torn that it's probably the biggest impact he can have is on domestic anti-Semitism.
But Nigam, when you look at the math of this, and I know we've had the public reflection by Anthony Housefather and ultimately deciding to stay, but to Tanda's point, had that motion gone ahead unamended, it could have been a real visceral split inside the Liberal caucus. And this just shows the efforts that they have to go through to keep everything together as this conflict rips apart the country in many ways.
There are some ridings where even the wording, while watered down for this motion, came through in supporting the movement towards the state of Palestine or a potential two-state solution. It just won't serve in other ridings. I happen to be sitting in the riding where the other dissenting Liberal MP, Ben Carr, and in this riding, you would nothing recognizing anything looking like a two-state solution is even a rational discussion in conversations over here. In this particular area, similar to Housefather's riding, there is not a lot of movement or interest in being able to discuss a solution to this beyond just some of the real visceral outcomes that's coming forth. And so it's a real tricky move, I think, for the Liberal caucus to try to balance on this issue while still being humanitarian on it. I think the Liberals have done maybe the best they could do in terms of trying to just play it in such a way that they're thinking in a humanitarian way of what we can do, because this crisis is getting to the nth proportions, and it's coming to a point in which we're seeing not only aid workers being killed, but we're also seeing thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are suffering starvation on a daily basis in Gaza. And it's a crisis that is on the global proportions that everyone is looking at. And so it's very hard to continue in this pattern, to be able to look to anything other than maybe even recognizing that there is rights to be considered other than Israel's right.
So, Jason, it's interesting that, we follow the political reflections of one member of parliament, from one riding in Canada. But, the global politics on this is shifting this week in a profound way, with Joe Biden basically saying to Bibi Netanyahu, you've got to do this differently, or we may not have your back anymore. And then Benny Gantz, who's part of the war cabinet in Israel, saying we need to have elections earlier because of the political situation there. This is going to be a more tenuous issue for this government to deal with, given the fault lines in this country. And it seems to me some difficult moments ahead for Anthony Housefather, despite his decision to stay today.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've seen, some of the more, firm, passionate advocates, either on the pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel side, shifting as much as some of the more broad-based politics have in this. I don't know if you hear that, like I said, on either side. It's quite interesting that Mr. Housefather, I wonder if he decided or thought about, what can I do in this next term? I mean, I'm not sure if there's clarity on whether he's running again, but options would have been to stay in the Liberal caucus and try to advocate and persuade, the ministers and government policy and be in the governing caucus. Which will be deciding things from here till the writ, or go on to the Conservative side, deliver a massive political blow to the Liberal Party, and send a very strong signal to particularly Jewish voters, perhaps also Anglo-Quebec voters, which is another prominent group that he's been a staunch advocate for, often occasionally offside with the Liberals on. If he went, just to leave like that would be difficult. And also, it would only mean he was an advocate. He'd only be advocating, criticizing. And what's also interesting, though, is that a lot of the points that he mentioned in his statement, talking about support for business, support for robust foreign policy with traditional allies, those were core values that often the Conservatives wouldn't feel too offside about. He didn't mention some of the things like, housing affordability issues necessarily, or certainly nothing on, climate or energy, which are some of the larger wedges there. So I wonder if, ideologically he's not, he may have more alliances with the Liberals, because what he was talking about in your interview was kind of these classic Liberal, more moderate positions. And a lot of those have not been, where Justin Trudeau has taken the party. He's, tried to claim more of the left of center ground with much of his things. I mean, he doesn't, this was a mention of balanced budget that I haven't heard the Liberals talk about much in quite a while.
Yeah. Sorry, Nigan, you wanted to jump in?
I was just going to add in, he started using terms like balanced budget. So he did mention some stuff around affordability and austerity, around some of the issues around economy.
Yeah, fiscal sustainability. I can't remember the exact phrase, but Tanda, a lot of what he was saying, he was staying to advocate, can be read as like a little bit of a criticism of things.
Or a
it's
warning.
like, yeah,
Or
it's
a
like
warning.
almost like I'm one of the
Sure.
few centrists left in this party. We
Balanced
can't be
budget.
the NDP light. That's kind of what it sounded like, or
Yeah,
could
it's
be
a bit of a
interpreted as.
poke. I think he wants to retain some influence and not look like he just caved and on a decision that must have been a tough one. But I think, we're also missing some of the other political considerations here. I mean, he had to be concerned when Pierre Poilievre went into his own riding into a synagogue and spoke to hundreds of people there and got a rousing reception from the Jewish community in that riding. So I think, he wants to still be a bit of a thorn in this government side. He still wants to speak to them about how I think maybe, I don't know if tenuous is the correct answer, but the correct word, but it clearly this government faces big challenges in keeping the support of the Jewish vote, and that is going to matter in the next election. Look, I mean, whether Housefather had gone or not this time round wouldn't have threatened necessarily the Liberal government position. They would have had 155 MPs versus the Conservatives about 118 or so. So, in that respect, his staying or going wouldn't have tipped some balance, but it would have tipped, I think, a sense of political importance to this government of that community.
But on that, Marie, it feels like the Liberals have avoided two real difficult moments over this motion, in that they got an amendment that they could support and get the NDP to support, and not have this vote split that Tanda was outlining in their caucus on a pretty key issue of recognizing a Palestinian state, and they've avoided the loss of an outspoken Jewish MP in the middle of them attempting to take control of the political narrative with this budget rollout. You know what I mean? It's like they've avoided two potential real big problems on this, despite still being embroiled in public controversy. The outcomes weren't terrible for them.
For now, but
Yes, for now. Everything is for now on
but
this.
they
Yeah.
also almost lost a prominent Liberal MP in Montreal because they amended the motion to try and avoid that 80 other MPs voted for the motion. So I think one is because of the other, not one parallel to the other. And I've been saying this for a long time, and I feel it more and more. I think the simple fact that Mr. Housefather almost even left, someone who says he's been Liberal since he's been a teenager, shows just how untenable this sort of middle ground, trying to appease tensions in caucus, but also in society with both communities, it's just not tenable. I'm not saying it's easy. You don't pick one or the other, but it is going to become more and more of a challenge as the war goes on. And Tonda's right; it's clearly not ending anytime soon, and it's not getting any more palatable. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
With everything that's going in, that's just getting worse and worse.
But Jason, it's an interesting exercise in caucus management that we've seen, right? That this level of dissent and public disagreement and reflection from a parliamentary secretary who was not demoted as a parliamentary secretary for voting against this and expressing his disappointment in what his government is doing. They did the outreach to him to keep him on board and gave him a new role that he says he's happy with. I think, when the inside stories of the last couple of months of the Liberal caucus and the conversations comes out, it's going to be quite a fascinating exercise in risk mitigation and caucus management.
I would love to know the level of negotiations or discussions there were between Mr. Housefather and Freeland and Trudeau. I would love to know what kind of conversations he had with some Conservative leaders. If Mr. Poilievre gave him some FaceTime, 'cause I'm sure that would have been a delightful victory for him in the political constituency he's really trying to deliver. This is and let's keep in mind the Liberals are not the only caucus with a mixture of both Jewish and Muslim members who might feel, at least privately, very differently on this. But it is seemingly the only caucus with open Brooks, or at least has open dissent on these issues, or open disagreements of opinion on these.
Okay, Nigan, I got to take a break, but I'm going to give the last word to you. What are your thoughts?
I would just add that not to be really glass half empty, but I mean, one of the other things here is that we see that the Liberals are able to give Anthony Housefather a way out of this situation, because it was a situation in which perhaps he may have not considered really seriously at all to join the Conservatives, especially with this kind of railing on several different issues that he feels within the Liberal caucus that need to be sort of core Liberal values. And one of the most important motivating factors of all politicians is self-preservation. And I guess it will withstand time to see whether he runs again. But I think he is a longtime politician that would look to also out for himself in this particular riding.
Well, his final answers to me in the interview earlier made it sound like it was either Liberals or the Conservatives, because he said being an independent, which I know some people had advised him to do, he said has no power in the system. He can't speak. He was never going to do that. So, it sounds like the Prime Minister avoided a defection to the official opposition.